If I could please call the meeting to order. Madam Clerk, at 7 o'clock, we are in Council Chambers Monday, September the 28th, 2015. This is our first 2016 budget meeting. I'd like to welcome everyone. There is no one who's signed up to speak. Certainly, if anybody comes in through the meeting, we'll do our best to accommodate them. First of all, councillors, and declarations of pecuniary interest, please. Seeing none, Madam Clerk, may I please have a motion to approve the agenda as been circulated by Legal and Legislative Services? Councillor Maracus, thank you. Councillor Thompson, comments or questions on the agenda? All in favor? Contrary? That is carried. Thank you. As I mentioned, we don't have any members of the public at this point. We will come back. I'm sorry. We do have one member of the public who is here. And if that gentleman would like to come forward and make any comments, we're more than happy. Otherwise, we'll come back if anybody wants to speak. So thank you. We will move to delegations. And Monsieur Elliott. Oh, okay. Thank you. As the clerk just reminded, if we could have a motion to waive procedural bylaw. Councillors Gartner and Thompson, comments or questions? All in favor? Contrary? That's carried. And I'm sorry, I should have said that up front. We do tend to run our budget meetings a little less formally than we do a council meeting. It's just, it encourages better participation amongst members of council.
So I can say whatever I want anytime I want?
Not quite that informally, okay? Not quite that informally, but, you know, we're close. But we do encourage as many questions as possible, and we do try and keep it as informal as possible. Mr. Elliott, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of Budget Committee. For those watching online from home, the slides that I'm going to be going through tonight will be posted to our website first thing in the morning, and all members of committee have those in front of you. The theme of our evening tonight is continuing to invest in infrastructure. My role here tonight is to introduce the capital budget and a number of important documents. But first off, I want to assure you that there's no decisions to make, there's no approvals being sought tonight. All of that begins to happen next week. And so I'm just going to set some context for next week's deliberation meeting. And we're going to look at and walk you through two reports that are printed on your agenda tonight: the review of the financial health of the organization, and then separately an overview of the 2016 capital investment program. We've continued to work on streamlining this budget process for council, and so we're here again to help set some context, set the table, as it were, for next week's discussions. And at the end of the meeting, we'll be handing out, you can see this side of the table, we've already got our binders here. We'll be handing out the budget binders, and there will be some homework for you to review in that prior to next week's budget meeting. So there's two introductory reports. One is more context, and then one is more overview of the actual budget document. In the binder, you will find, this is kind of confusing, two reports tonight, but there's three documents in the binder for you to review. The asset management plan, which we introduced to you last year and just received it last year. This year we will be seeking approval of that plan because that's a requirement for us to continue to receive infrastructure funding from the province and the federal government. And so that asset management plan really is the documentation of how we go about capital planning here at Aurora. How we do it, how we assess, what are the general conditions of our assets, how are they categorized, and then that work produces the 10-year capital plan. That's the fruit of implementing the asset management plan. With the 10-year capital plan, we also have the funding program in the back. So those two documents are regularly reviewed by ourselves, by our staff, by each asset category manager. The third document that you'll find in your binder is the 2016 detailed capital budget. So it's the detail of the first year of that 10-year plan, and it's all of the priority projects that we are recommending to be undertaken in 2016. In recent years, we've made great strides in moving towards a model of strong fiscal sustainability. We have introduced and developed a consolidated 10-year capital investment plan. It's currently showing $187 million of investment over the next 10 years. We have been building the new annual cash to capital contributions to reserves, and that approach helps us separate capital discussions from operating. It helps stabilize the tax rates from volatility. We've also introduced and watched and began using our new work order and asset management system for the planning and tracking of our infrastructure investments. We've been following the new asset management plan and documenting our practices to do that. We have approved a reserve fund strategy corporately to set goals, targets, document the purposes of each. We've updated the development charges bylaw to optimize the revenue that we collect from the growth community. And that was done back in 2014. We've established a new service level and business unit approach to documenting our operating budget. We created a finance advisory committee. Collectively, we've updated our approach to our annual budgets and the detailed reviews. And last week you saw and discussed, so it's pending approval tomorrow night, budget principles and council budget process documents that all members of the public and all members in the process can refer to and be on the same page. I just wanted to go back. There's been a lot of talk about trying to make sure that we communicate what our financial health looks like. And so there's a document in the agenda tonight has a little bit more detail what I'm going to show on the slides. But really, we just want to give you an overview here and those watching this presentation. The net worth of the corporation. Net worth is very much like when you play Monopoly and at the end of the game you have to cash out to find out who has the most money. So net worth is like if we cashed out and sold our assets and stacked up all our cash, what would we have? Our net worth at the end of 2014 was $461 million, almost $500 million. So we can talk about being the managers of a $500 million organization. That's what we have. Pardon me? Sell out. I was thinking about buying out maybe a neighboring municipality.
We're not that informal, okay?
Of that $461 million, it includes $76.5 million of cash and investment vehicles that are convertible to cash fairly readily. And so that is where we're at from an organization and size and again, more context. When we look at our asset base, we talk about amortized cost. That's an accounting term. What's amortized cost? Think about buying a car. You pay $20,000 or $40,000 for your car. You drive it off the curb and down the street one block. It's suddenly worth $37,000 because it's depreciated. So they tell you. So amortized cost is the depreciated value of our assets. What did we pay for it, and what have we used or burned up or consumed of it? And so this is a measure of the historical cost. Our total assets that we own is just under $400 million, and you can see that that's growing from 2013. Our reserve contribution that we transfer into those reserves to look after our assets, $6.8 million, growing from the year before, so we are on the right track. As a percent of our amortization, which some municipalities use as a measure of how close in you're measuring your infrastructure deficit, we're at 62% of our amortization.
Excuse me, Mr. Elliott, I think Councillor Perry has a question.
On this slide, contributions as a percentage of amortization, is that the right trend we're looking for? And where it's going down, or would we want to see that going up as well? And what would be a number that we're striving for?
Best practice would be to strive for more than 100%.
Okay.
Because this is historic cost, and we need to be concerned about being able to pay at replacement value. The The trend is backwards this year because we assumed a number of subdivisions and infrastructure from developers, and so it diluted our contribution just slightly. Very good question, though. We have a good history of our tax cash to capital, and I just take this slide back, and I am not pointing my finger to anybody or any group of councillors or any group of staff. But you can see from this chart, since 2010, we have had a regular and pretty much predictable contribution increase to our reserves, or contributions to reserves. Each year we've been adding almost 1% for 4 years straight, and then we dropped it down a bit. This year we have another 1% in our draft budget at this time. But you can see before that, the whole notion of infrastructure deficits was just beginning to emerge in the industry across the country and across the globe, actually. As the accounting standards changed, as the funding crisis began in the city of Toronto with their undergrounds, you could see that we didn't really have a plan before that. We now have a plan. We're on track, we're organized, and we have a good handle on our assets and what's happening. We have to continue that trend, and you'll see that a little bit later. The volatility that we had before also contributed to volatility of our tax rates, and that made it very difficult to predict longer term and out-year tax rates. So now we have predictable cash to capital, and when we say cash to capital, that's where we're taking tax money and we're setting it into reserve on a continuous amount basis. We're actually increasing it each year. And then that reserve serves as a buffer as the actual spend on our capital fluctuates year to year. And so it's a buffer between the tax rate and the capital budget. When we look at our assets, they are, in general, fairly new. We're a young growth community. Much of our growth has happened since the 90s. And so our assets, this sort of says, what's our consumption ratio? We have used about a third, on average, our assets. You can't see it, but the underground pipes are clogging, they're cracking, they're corroding, they're doing different things. You can't see that until you've got a camera down there. But 1/3 of our assets have been used up. It's like if you think your car is worth 300,000 kilometers, you've driven it 100,000 kilometers. But that's on average across the road. We need to, the reason that this is a good picture for us is it gives us time to address the funding issues that are facing municipalities across the country. Places like the City of Toronto, where they're closer to 80% consumed, have a much shorter time frame to make up for huge funding gaps, and that's going to put extreme pressures on their taxes and other funding sources. Our owned assets, this chart just plots out what do we own and how's it distributed. Again, the $157 million of underground structures. This is pipes, sewer mains, water mains, valves, storm scepters, and all kinds of things. That's largely unseen, and so this is what's contributed in part to the infrastructure deficit. Nobody can see the wear and tear on those, but they are wearing and tearing, and we see that through numbers of water main breaks and so on. And we need to make sure that we continue to invest in our infrastructure so that we can maintain the service levels that those deliver. So you can see underground is $157 million. I'm not going to read them all. Land and land improvements, those don't depreciate, but we have almost $100 million of land and land improvements. And then roads, lighting, and sidewalks. So the undergrounds, the linears, make up a big piece of our depreciable assets. So we can't, I couldn't overemphasize the importance of continuing active investment in these assets, active renewal, maintenance, and management of these assets. And each category for the town is managed by a separate, specific individual accountable for the service levels of those assets, and they're increasingly being held accountable for stretching their reserve funds to optimize the investment for dollar and the service for dollar that they invest. We look at our reserve funds and what's the status of our reserve funds. A lot of people say, oh, we got lots of money in our reserves. I don't even have a total on here because it's important not to think of it as all the same. It's all different. We have reserves for new infrastructure, about $15.7 million for new infrastructure. We have reserves about $11 million for our existing infrastructure, looking after and replacing that stuff when it's time. We have special purposes reserves, things like trails donations, different things. We have stabilization reserves to help buffer us from specific shocks, such as workmen's compensation claims and different things. We have, then the biggest piece of the pie is that mystery called the hydro sale reserves. We have no specific purpose for it. And we have to be careful not to spend that multiple times in our mind and plan for it multiple times. And so it's there, it's large, and but it has no specific purpose, so we can't spend it on growth assets if somebody else thinks that we should be spending it for something else. There's rules around it, and we can talk about that another day, but there's $35.6 million combined in that reserve. A little further financial context. A lot of people talk about, well, you got debt, what's going on? You must be in tough shape. We are not in tough shape. Our total debt at December of 14 was just over $4 million, and that's down from just about $6 million in 2013. We have payment plans. We have a program to stick to those. We are funding those debts, and we're paying them off. The province limits us as to how much debt we can assume, not by the total amount of debt, but rather the total amount of debt and interest payments we have to pay each year. They call it the payment limit. So our annual payment limit is just over $16 million for 2015. The payments that we made in 2014 are $1.7 million. So we're running only just under 11% of our total limit. If I were to extrapolate that backwards, we have an available limit of a further $14.4 million per year of debt and interest payments. I don't recommend it, not at all. But this is like saying we have a $10,000 limit on our credit card, but we're only going to keep it at about $1,000 or $1,200 because we don't want to find ourselves in trouble and get out of control. So that's the picture of our debt for those that are interested in that. We can also see, though, that we do know that for 2015 and 16, our debt will increase. We've got authorized debt for the Joint Operations Center, and we've got pending approval for debt with respect to the LED lighting conversion that we spoke of last week. So those will be increasing. Well within our limits, though. When I look at the 10-year capital plan, and you'll be seeing it when we distribute tonight, it contains the 2015 approved budget for context and 10 future years, including 16. There's a total of 370 projects and $205 million of investment in the next 10 years. 250 of those projects are repairing and replacing what we already have for about half of the amount. Roads and buildings are the biggest components there. And then 101 growth and new projects. That includes some things like, I don't want to startle you too much, additional library space is in that 10-year plan, a new community center. We're aware of a new fire hall and headquarters in the plan. Those are in that plan. They're not necessarily approved capital projects yet, but as managers and advisors to council, we have no choice but be prudent and look out and see what's coming down the road and be planning for it. What we can say, we have a plan in the funding component of the 10-year capital plan. If council follows that plan, we can honestly say we have a fully funded 10-year asset management plan in place. But that caveat is there that we have to follow the plan. Here's what our plan looks like for repair and replacement. I'm just going to give you this as an example. Just give you a little picture here, the blue bars represent the annual planned investment in asset renewal. You can see that it fluctuates year to year. Some people, the economists, say that that's a lumpy plan. It fluctuates year to year. This is why we use reserves to buffer that and help fund it. The green bars represent the balance of the reserve funds for tax-funded R&R. You can see in the middle, as the plan unfolds, the balances go down into the deficit, but rebound by the end of the 10-year period. And that's because we see the red line, which is our cash to capital contributions, is increasing each year. We're diligently planning an increase to those reserves. So this is a very sustainable looking plan. We end with a strong balance, sufficient to buffer fluctuations in the spend. We end up with strong contributions matching or exceeding our annual planned spends. And it's clearly a documented plan that says we know what we're doing, we know where we're going. As long as we stay on track, it's got a happy ending. If we don't stay on track, if we were to stop our increases to contributions to reserves and just hold the line steady, you can quickly see that our reserve balances go down and down and down. An unsustainable pattern. We would have no choice but to seriously curtail our spending on existing infrastructure. And that would cause great strain on those assets. It would begin to noticeably impact the service delivery of those assets, whether it's roads, pipes, pool tanks, ice plants. And so we should all in this room be wanting to avoid any contribution towards a scenario like that. And so if we follow the plan, take small steps every year, we can end with that healthy picture.
Mr. Elliott?
Yes.
Councillor Kim.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The previous slide that shows the R&R reserves with increments, so it's a pretty healthy looking graph where by 2025 the reserves are fully loaded and everything looks pretty healthy. Is there anything other than acts of God, nature, that could curtail this forecast in any way?
Political will.
I mean, something that we might have overlooked, like if we decide to build a bigger rec center or rec centers in the forecast, or is there something that hasn't been, can come from left field that could curtail this?
I'd like to believe that, and I do believe that our asset managers have been thorough in the 10-year window at least here. What's in the next 10 years? I haven't seen that yet. I know that our engineering group are looking much further out on their linears, the undergrounds and the roads, sidewalks. But we just keep looking at this plan and update it every year, and so that still gives us 10 years in the event that there's a major shock. But if you had 3 or 4 arena roofs to do in 1 year, you'd see that coming and you'd try to spread it out. But it also gives you time for the financial plan. Acts of God, I think the greatest risk might be dramatic economic shock in a global economy, whether it's dramatic inflation in the cost of replacing these assets, loss of investment income, crashing to zero, or it would be extreme. But at this point in time, we've got our interest rate forecasts in there, we've got our growth forecasts, and clearly a planned increment to our contributions to reserves each year. And that's what takes us to the picture.
Thank you, Mr. Elliott.
And it's good that we have a 10-year plan. So what is our 2016 capital plan? Our repair and replacement of existing assets, we are investing or recommending the investment of $8.25 million. For growth and new infrastructure, we separate these because they're funded differently, primarily from developer-driven contributions through development charges. $5.5 million for that. We have studies and other periodic projects that have an opportunity to drive fluctuations in our tax rate. We budget for those differently here. And so we've got $350,000 of those for a total proposed capital budget of $14 million. Inside that, you will find a lot of roads and facilities, underground and Parks and Rec, our biggest areas, of course. So the infrastructure repair and replacement reserves are funding this. We do have that plan. It's sustainable. In 2016, our program proposed today is $8.25 million. The 5-year average from the last 5 years is just under $8 million, so it's right in the ballpark. But we are trending in the right direction. We're investing in our infrastructure. On the growth and new side, we see that the 5-year average is about $8.7 million normally, and this year it's 5.5. It just happens to be timing of when these new assets need to be put in, our ability to deliver those projects, and meet the community needs. And so we see projects in Parks and Rec, more projects in underground and roads related, and fleet. There's some growth in our fleet, obviously. We've got more roads to cover and parks to look after. And we have some growth in new infrastructure, even for the planning department. So those are all detailed in the binder that you'll get tonight. And again, these categories are all managed fairly independent of each other, but I want to assure you that the underground infrastructure and the roads infrastructure are carefully planned and collaborated with together, because the last thing we want to do is put down a new road and then 2 years later dig it up to put in pipes. So those, of course, are managed by the same department. It makes sense. They are carefully planned and coordinated. The rest are pretty much independent of each other, but as a collective team, we make sure that we are coordinating with each other as well. What are the next steps in this budget process, the adventure that we have before us? The next budget meeting is next Monday. It's a 9 o'clock start. It's going to be a long day, so be comfortable. We will be reviewing I need you folks to review the capital budget binder that's distributed tonight. Now, this is the binder that will also receive, and you will insert the operating budget in it, so it's all indexed. The only material that's in there is tabs 9 through 13, though. And so I need you to go through those, and we'll have a discussion primarily about the asset management plan and the 10-year capital plan to start the day. Hopefully we can get through that in reasonably short order, because the key financial decisions that we're making are in the 2016 approved capital or proposed capital plan, and that's the last sections that you'll review. In the 2016 capital plan, there are detailed sheets for each proposed project, setting out the justification, what it is, where it is, how much it costs, different things. I encourage you to speak with the department head this week. If you have any questions, we're all around, and we'd be happy to have a conversation with you about how we came up with those priorities or any details that you need to know about those projects. Once we get through our day on Monday, we hope to complete our review of the capital on the Monday, and then the committee recommendations will be going directly to a council meeting shortly thereafter for final approval, so that our managers can get underway preparing tenders and setting out the plans for next year. Mr. Mayor, that concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions, and then we can get a score of the game update and go home.
What's the magic number? Thank you very much, Mr. Elliott. Council, may I please first have a motion to receive Mr. Elliott's presentation? Councillors Pirie and Tom. Councillor Pirie, you had a question.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Mr. Elliott. In 2021, when we're looking at our highest levels of debt in the reserve balance, what are the debt and interest payment limits going to be looking like?
I'm sorry, through you, Mr. Chair. You're looking at the slide on the repair and replacement reserves?
Yes.
In 2021, that is, what's our debt limits look like? What we're seeing there is a projected deficit of not quite $4 million. And as I mentioned earlier, our debt limit, actually I didn't mention it earlier, our debt limit, the document I received from the province suggested that I could borrow on a 20-year term at 5% interest, about $140 million. So we're well within our
Perfect.
debt limits if we were to actually to formally finance that.
Thank you.
Councillor Thompson.
Thank you, Mayor Daw, and thank you, Mr. Elliott, for the presentation. Just, I guess, a general question around the 10-year capital plan. And we often talk about trying to optimize the life of an asset. And so you stated in one of your slides that, roads represent over 50% of the repair and replacement projects that we'll do in 2016. And I know that we often have a conversation when the blue sheets come before us with regards to the pavement index, the life cycle of the roads. And so are we going to continue to look at ways to optimize those life by working with Mr. Simonoska's team and so forth when it comes to fleets and roads to determine whether or not those life cycles, that we're repairing it at the right time? Because, there's part of a challenge for us in terms of the value of the assets, the repair, the replacement of it, and that, if we can squeeze a couple more years out of the roads, then perhaps from our 10-year perspective, it saves the community some money in the long run. But it's always a challenging issue when we talk about it at budget time.
Mr. Simonoskis?
Certainly through you, Mr. Mayor. So in the 8 years that I've been here, we've actually done one sort of readjustment of our roads program and reduced it by about, I want to say by about 30% by spreading projects out, and that was based on a condition assessment done about 6 years ago. We have plans to do another condition assessment coming up in 2015, late 15, early 16, and we'll take that opportunity to do another reassessment to see if the current spending profile is adequate, or what I'd like to one of the concerns that I have with our roads program is to make sure, just as you've described, that we're not over-investing. If the roads can sustain 2 or 3 more additional years of use without over deterioration, then the optimal time would be extended a little bit. So that definitely is something we look at on a regular basis.
Great. Look forward to seeing that when you get to it either later this year or next year.
Other questions to Mr. Elliott's presentation, please? Councillor Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Elliott. On page 5, so these are owned tangible assets. Some of these assets, like the SARC, have debt on them still. So when we say it's owned, how is the debt portion included in that?
Mr. Elliott, please.
This is the page that has total capital assets and capital reserve contributions on it?
No, it's the
Oh,
one that
sorry.
has 2014 tangible capital assets, net millions.
Yes.
Is that the same? Okay.
That's the, thank you, that's the total value at cost of that facility. The debt is accounted for separately. That's a liability side.
Thank you. Any idea what the debt is?
That is actually detailed, I believe, in the report that's on your table tonight. No, I'll have something with me next Monday detailing out the debt that we have formally for the SARC, the internal debt that we have formally in place for the library, and then an update on the JOC as well.
Thank you. And on page 7, the R&R reserves with increments. We're spending money that we don't have, which will cost us interest. But is any of this DC spending where the interest portion will be covered?
Through you, Mr. Chair, no, this is all for tax rate funded assets. It's not utilities.
Thank you.
It's tax rate funded assets. It is not DC eligible. This is repairing and replacing the existing assets. The DCs only buy brand new assets that arise, or the need is driven by growth.
By growth, thank you, of course. Thank you.
Councillor Thompson.
Thank you again. Councillor Gardner raised the question about debt, and there was a slide on the financial context. It did say our total debt was about $4 million, which was decreased from last year, and that as a percentage of our limit is only 10%. But perhaps we could take this opportunity to get an additional perspective from our interim CAO. I know that he's had an opportunity to work in many different municipalities. Perhaps he'd like to add a comment with regards to our debt or financial health, if he wouldn't mind.
Mr. Ressier.
I think that there are many, many, many municipalities that would like to be in the position the town of Aurora is currently in. And again, a function of it, I think, is the work of council. Also, you have the benefit of geography and age. Frankly, many of the older communities in the province of Ontario have significant infrastructure deficits. Their bridges are crumbling, roads are falling apart. There's just watch the news, the Toronto-based media in particular, and you hear about water main breaks and so on. So as a consequence, those councils are in a very difficult position because there's a limit to how much people want to pay in taxes. Their infrastructure is old, and frankly, there wasn't enough thought perhaps given many, many years ago in those communities of doing what Mr. Elliott is suggesting that you do tonight, which is set money aside when times are good to help you deal with the cost of repairing and replacing infrastructure. That's a message which I think sometimes is not often received well by some municipalities because it's not spending money on things that are immediately obvious to people. I think one of the benefits, one of the outcomes of Walkerton, I think, indicated that it's important to invest in infrastructure that ensures the health and safety of people, core number one responsibility. I'm sure in that community, that when around budget time, when they were having discussions about options for spending, dealing with your water supply system in that municipality obviously wasn't a priority. Something probably else was a priority. So as a consequence of that, and I think the Treasurer referenced the fact that municipalities are required to have an asset management plan, AMPT, it's called. And essentially that was the province saying, stop. Everyone's got to take complete stock of all of your assets, value the assets, and have a plan to repair and replace those assets. And if you don't have one of those, you're not getting gas tax money. You're not going to be getting any infrastructure funding from the federal and provincial government. So this was something that was driven by the senior levels of government, and I think you're well ahead of the curve. You've done your homework, you've got a plan in place, and I think you're in good shape. In terms of the specifics of debt, debt is a four-letter word. I appreciate that. But you're well within your limits. The province, again, sets a limit for how much debt you can have. It's an annual amount, and you're well within that. So my sense is that this council, in the last number of years, have set all of the set of framework, basically, which is going to serve this council and future councils extremely well. You've not taken any risks. You have a plan, and I think, as the Treasurer indicated, you would be surprised at the number of large municipalities that don't look 10 years into the future, that don't do the work which is being done by this council and by your staff. So I think you're in a very good position. And I think this sets the framework, I think, for the conversation around the specifics for the 16 capital budget and the operating budget in the weeks to come.
Thank you. Councillor. Any comments for Councillor Kim?
Further to that, Mr. Mayor, to either Mr. CAO or Mr. Elliott, the report states that we rank pretty favorably in the BMA study, roughly around 70%. The study average is 7%, we're at 145%. Sorry, I'm looking at page 3.
Councillor Kim, if this is to the report, we're going to get to that shortly. If there's anything specific to Mr. Elliott's presentation, otherwise we can close that and we'll go to the report.
Okay, sure.
All right. Any other comments or questions specific to Councillor Abel?
Thank you very much. I just had a couple of questions. One we're all around it is the debt, Mr. Mayor, and we have $4 million in debt. Could Mr. Elliott just sort of give us an idea of the top 3 items that have incurred that debt?
Through you, Mr. Chair, it's actually only 2. It's the SARC. We overbuilt that, and so we funded or financed the overbuilt portion of it to be funded and paid for by future growth. And so we financed the construction of that oversize and then are paying it off with the collection of development charges from the growing community. We're still doing that. So we have the SARC, and we also did something similar to for overbuilding the size of the library at the time that we built that. We financed that internally in a fairly formal basis, and we're paying that off. Our last debt payment, I believe, is 2025.
Thank you very much. On page 7, R&R, reserves with increments, and I think Councillor Perry basically touched on the 2021 portion of it. To me, it looks like the capital spend is fairly steady, but it seems to be declining in the last 4 or 5 years. And I'm looking at a phrase, spend now. Would that be a fair sort of comment?
Through Mr. Chair, actually, I'm just back from a conference on, and there was a lot of discussion about infrastructure renewal and funding and making wise decisions in that regard. Sometimes you invest partway through the life of an asset to renew it a bit, whether that's, for example, like taking your old car and saying, well, before I give it to my son, I'm going to give it a new paint job and a fresh set of shocks, so it will last longer. There's wisdom in making certain investments at certain times through the life of an asset, and it makes it last longer. If you don't do that, it crumbles much faster than it otherwise would. And so there is wisdom in doing that. That's the art of asset management. That's the function of the asset managers themselves, who are specialists in their domains. And the asset management plan that is before you tonight in the binder sets out how each of those categories of assets are evaluated and the different types of investments that are made along the life cycle of the asset.
Okay, so I appreciate it. I'm just looking at the blue bars, and in our term, it looks like we're spending a lot. It looks like once we hit 2022, we go down quite a bit, and that's basically driven through the asset function of the asset management, as you said.
That's correct.
Thank you very much. I appreciate on number 9, the 5-year average of both those tables that you showed, those pies. That's very helpful. Councillor Thompson related that for 2016, roads and repair was closer to 50%, but I see here it's 30%. Okay, it's still a sizable chunk. That wasn't really my question. On the bottom graph, you have BBS and PRS in both those pie shapes. Would you mind just clarifying what those are, please?
BBS is Building Bylaw Services.
Microphone, Mr. Elliott, please.
I'm sorry. Through you, Mr. Chair, BBS is Building and Bylaw Services, or Tasha's department. And so they're related to the different departments. So there's BBS, and CFS is my own, and PRS, Parks Recreation Services.
Thank you. And those are my questions. Thank you very much.
Any other comments to Mr. Elliott's presentation? All in favor of receipt then, please? Contrary? That's carried. And just before we go to the first item, Mr. Elliott, you've got 3 members of your staff, and I should have asked you to introduce them a bit earlier, if you would care to introduce them now, sir.
I appreciate that. You will be seeing a lot of my team throughout the coming weeks. To my left is Jason Gardner, our Manager of Financial Planning. You've seen him many times. Up in the back, we have Karen Aretto on the left and Tracy Pardue on the right. And a third member of our team is Laura Sheardown, and she's unable to join us tonight. The 3 gals, together with Jason, each of them have been assigned to specific departments to assist in anything financial, including their budgets and their capital budgets and their long-range plans and so on. And so it's a complete team effort, and very positive feedback from my colleagues on the management team that they are leaning more and more on these financial advisors and appreciate the help that they offer. And so it's a very effective team, and so they're part of the whole budget team, this whole table plus my crew.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Elliott. Council, we have 2 items to deal with. If someone would put the first one on the floor, please, which is the receipt for information, Councillor Perry, Councillor Tom. I will ask Mr. Elliott just to give a quick overview, and then we can open that up for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, this is just a review of the financial health. This is a bit of an intro. It's not exactly the answer to Councillor Humphrey's motion for an annual report, but I did want to get what we could on the table at this time. It includes a little bit of comparators to some other municipalities. Reference to the BMA study was made earlier. And I've tried to take what is sometimes very complicated accounting terminology from a financial statement analysis perspective and try to convey that in lay terms to the residents who may choose to read this and for members of council. All members of council come at financial matters at different degrees of understanding or, quite frankly, interest. And I recognize that, I value that, because that brings diversity to the table. And so this report was written for perhaps the first-time reader that's watching or picks this up off the agenda. It's context for where we're at, how are we healthy, what are the facts about our debt, how much cash do we have, and so on.
Thank you, Mr. Elliott. Councillor Kim, you had a question?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Mr. CAO or Mr. Elliott. Regarding the BMA study, so Aurora fared fairly well at 145%, whereas the study average was 70%. Would it be any different if, I would imagine that the study, the municipalities in the studies are at various stages of their growth cycle. I suspect Aurora is somewhere in the, if I can use a baseball term, 7th or 8th inning of the growth cycle, whereas others might well be in extra innings and kind of stagnating in their growth, or some earlier in the game. So if this study were to compare everyone and compare Aurora with others in the same same part of the growth cycle, would we have fared similarly as great as is indicated here?
Mr. Elliott?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I don't have the charts in front of me that the BMA study offers, but I'd be happy to clip those couple of pages from the study and circulate them to members of council. It is looking at our reserve fund, discretionary reserve fund balances as a percentage of our tax levy. And so we're at 145%. The average, as my document says, the average in the study is 70%. And I think there was 98 municipalities in that, 95 participating municipalities out of 388, I believe, in Ontario. But these are, a lot of them are centralized here in the GTA and along the southern edges of Ontario. We participate in it so that we get this valuable information that helps put us in context of how are we doing to relative to our neighbors, but we also have to look inwards and say, how are we doing and what should we be doing to improve our health? It's one thing to be concerned about keeping up with the Joneses, as it were, but we need to be making sure that we're making wise decisions along the way as well.
Councillor?
I guess where I'm getting at is, I'm sure, we are indeed in a better financial footing than other municipalities. But myself being new to this arena, I'm wondering whether the fact that we have a growing tax base and other benefits of a growing municipality, whereas that offers us a lot more flexibility in our finances than those who might have topped out in terms of their tax base growth. And if that's the case, is it a fair comparison? So it's just more of a, what's your perspective on it in terms of if we were judged, evaluated apples to apples, whether we would be in such a high percentile ranking?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think perhaps the stage of growth may contribute to it, but I think the measure is more on one of how much have you saved to help service your infrastructure? What's in your rainy day account for next year's infrastructure failures? And how responsive can you be financially to those issues that press upon every municipality? And so those municipalities at the lower end of the scale have less flexibility, less financial capability of responding to those issues. And it's a reflection of their past financial management, their past financial practices, past decisions. But again, I think the best approach would be to clip the 95 municipalities, the listing and the rankings of that, and just circulate that so that you can see who and how these are comparing against. And I trust it will become self-evident as to the universality of this comparison.
Councillor?
Thank you. And just one comment, and just to kind of support what Mr. Elliott was saying last week or a couple of weeks ago regarding the one of the reports about our debt payments, and on page 2, we have about 1.75 of debit interest. Just in case if anyone else is interested to know, I was curious as to what our investment income was, and it was 2.3 million. So just to kind of support what Mr. Elliott was saying in terms of the opportunity costs, and certainly it does pay to borrow as opposed to using other assets to fund the service levels. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Tom.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And kind of following on that, on page 2, Mr. Elliott, just wanted to know of the total debt and interest payments for 2014, is that interest, or is that principal and interest? And if it's both, do you have a sense of how much interest we're paying?
Mr. Elliott?
If you give me 3 minutes, it is both, and I'll have a sense for the split.
Thanks.
Any other comments? Councillor Abel, Councillor Gardner.
Thank you very much, and appreciate all the information. And I was just thinking, this is my 6th budget that I'll be doing, and it's amazing how much I learn every single time. I'm going to try and say it becomes a little more clearer. I think with a good financial picture, and I like the comparators because when I went to AMO a number of years ago, we talked about Wawa, and Wawa is a town that is absolutely devastated, in decline, as Councillor Kim was alluding to. When you compare some municipalities to others, yes, we are fortunate we are in a growth. What I think is very important is that we maintain growth in economic drivers, and that will help sustain long-term, as well as infrastructure and transportation, et cetera, et cetera. So we still have much to do apart from the budget. I think one of our goals down the road will probably be looking at ways to attract that economic driver, which will give us that sustainability. However, having said that, it's comforting to know that we are going the right direction. It's something that our council did last term when we adopted a 10-year capital plan and investing in infrastructure. And I'm glad to see that we are moving in that trend, and it starts to show down the road. And when we compare ourselves with other municipalities, and the comments from our interim CAO would indicate we're probably fortunate, and we are moving in a collaborative way where we're using all our resources to move this in the best possible way.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Gardner.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor. I'm looking at page 5. Councillor Maracas pointed out to me when I was asking about debt before, at the bottom of that paragraph on total external debt, it says just over $4 million to the end of 2014. And then we would add our debt that we've incurred then, and of course the debt we're going to incur. So if we're looking at owned assets, so can I just take the owned asset figure for 2014 and minus this $4 million and get the right figure?
I don't think to say it's the right figure is correct. There's assets and liabilities. They're both correct figures.
I was asking, thank you, Mr. Mayor, I was asking with the owned assets, if that included the debt figure, and
No, I think that
doesn't.
It's net. Mr. Elliott?
The assets are the value of the assets, regardless of how much we owe. If you had a $400,000 home with a $300,000 mortgage, I would be saying in this document, your owned asset is $400,000.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. And when Councillor Abel was asking about what is incurring the debt and the interest, you didn't mention the new Joint Operations Center. Do you have any idea what that debt is at now?
Mr. Elliott?
As at the beginning of October, I believe it's just over $7 million. And we continue to report on that every month. And you'll see that as we go forward into the new year, I will be coming back with the long-term financing of that construction line of credit. I have to convert it to a long-term product.
Thank you. And with respect to the library, I think we must be close to $20,000 or $30,000, something very small there. In any case, it doesn't matter, but it's a very, very small portion of our debt.
Again, through you, Mr. Chair, I'll circulate the details of the debt as between the SARC and the library. I've done it recently, so it's handy.
Thank you. And following on the question about us being a growing community, my understanding is that for every dollar that we receive in taxes, it costs more to service that resident. I've heard it can be as high as, well, I've heard $1.35 mentioned, not for this community in particular, and I believe we've discussed this before. But does every tax dollar we get from our growing community completely service our residents?
Through you, Mr. Chair, there's a couple of ways of slicing this onion. For straight tax dollars, I could suggest that no, it does not fully service that growth, because our revenue side of our budget includes a lot more than just tax. Our total expenditure budget is close to $58 or $60 million, and only $37 million of that comes from taxes. The rest is from user fees, penalties, charges, investment income, development charges. There's a number of different sources of revenue that finance the operations of the town. And so to suggest that $1 of tax doesn't go to pay the $1.35 it costs to service that new resident, there's sort of truths on both sides of that story.
Thank you. And the truth that appeals to, or the aspect of that saying, how you say that truth, that is important to me is that, and I don't think it's always understood at the table, is that more residents coming into the town, bringing more tax dollars, is not, in all cases, a good thing. Because to service those residents, however you get the money, actually costs more than they're paying us. Would I be correct in saying that?
Mr. Elliott?
Through you, Mr. Chair, just at the conference that I was at, I had this very conversation with two different individuals from two very strong municipalities. One was absolutely adamant that growth does not pay, the growth tax dollar is not sufficient to pay for the cost of servicing that growth, and another treasurer absolutely adamant that it does. So the opinion is different, depends on the analysis, and quite frankly, I have not done that specific analysis here. And it's an awful lot of work to do that.
Yep. I'm going to go to Mr.
Thank you.
Just the theory behind all of this is that growth is supposed to pay for itself. So the province created the Development Charges Act and identified projects which were, or activities which would be growth related, and you could use the development charge regime as a way of collecting the dollars. Unfortunately, the Development Charges Act has what are called mandatory exemptions. So you can't recover 100% of everything. It's all quite legislated. So the taxpayer is responsible for some of the some of the costs of growth. There's no doubt about it. The trick in all of this is to make sure that as much of the growth-related costs are incurred by the development community. So things like negotiating things over and above what are in the development charges to make to essentially minimize the impact it has on the taxpayer in a community. The real issue, I think, that's confronting municipalities, and York is a very good example. York and Halton finance their growth-related major infrastructure in two completely different ways. The region of York relies on debt, and they have a lot of debt. They basically have had to get a special regulation approved by the province of Ontario to go beyond the debt limits that Mr. Elliott had referenced in his presentation. It's the only municipality that's done that, so they're well above that. Their theory is that growth will always be unabated in York Region, that you'll borrow money, but the development will always be there, and they will include those costs in their development charges to repay the debt. That's one model. The model that's used in Halton, which the developers absolutely abhor, is, well, if you want to proceed with the development, you'll be required to provide a financial plan to the satisfaction of the regional council. And essentially, it's a cash flow plan. So what happens is they essentially provide allocations or units to various developers, and they say, all right, as a result of this next 8,000 units going into Oakville, for example, it's going to trigger the requirements for all this new infrastructure. So there's a choice. The municipality can front end that cost, or the development community front ends that cost. And in Halton Region, they say, well, the developers have to pay for it. So when I left Halton Region, we just finished a negotiation where the developers were upfronting the cost of infrastructure to the tune of $1 billion. They had no planning approvals, they had no zoning, they had nothing. But they had to come up with $1 billion to pay for the cost of sewer and water plants and some road improvements. And essentially, they got their money back from other developers who are benefiting from that initial investment. So the region's job, or the municipality's job, is simply to be the banker. So you want to go, knock yourself out, you're going to have to pay $1 billion. As other developers take advantage of the investment made by the pioneers, they repay the original developers. So that's the approach that they use. The net result is it minimizes the impact it has on the existing property taxpayer, because they've decided as a policy of their regional government, the existing taxpayer is not going to be responsible nor bear the risk of paying for or paying back that infrastructure.
Councillor?
Thank you, and Halton's plan sounds much better than New York Region's to me. But going back to what Mr. Elliott said, and actually what is often said at this table is that we want the residents because we need their tax dollars. But if we are getting $1 from a resident and we are spending whatever, $1.20, $1.30, and in order to service that resident, we've got to have money from other sources, then I think we should be very careful about encouraging more residential development than we actually need.
Councillor Thompson.
Thank you, Mayor Daw. And I mean, you know, certainly it's an interesting question, and I'd love to see some more information from either other municipalities or our own. But I think you know, it's good to keep in mind the chart on page 6, which talks about the 2014 revenue sources. And while there's no doubt the biggest piece of the pie is property taxes, it's also good to be mindful of the fact that the next most significant piece of the pie is user charges and registration, so that, you know, residents, they don't only just pay property tax to the municipality, they use facilities, so there's fees that they pay, registrations, unfortunately there may be fines and penalties that they pay as well. So there's a number of revenue sources that we collect from our residents, not just property tax. So it may just be $1 of property tax, but there may be other revenue that they contribute to the overall health and well-being of the municipality. So it's something to consider. Is it 100% equal on both sides? I don't know. I'd leave that to our Director of Finance to figure out going forward. But I certainly think we don't just limit it to property tax. Residents contribute in many ways to the financial health of the municipality.
Any other comments or questions on this report? I think it's also important to note that when we had discussions a few months ago on our DCs, is that there's concerns expressed at this table that as our DCs go up, affordability of housing goes down. So there is always a balancing act as to what our DCs are going to be, how they affect the cost of a house, how that affects the ability of first-time homeowners coming in to our town. So I think that there's a bit of balance that has to go on here. Councillor, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, we encourage and we welcome new residents, but the pressure really is from developers themselves that own the property and the growth demands and pressures. So it's not like we can say, okay, let's stop and think about this and proceed. Applications are coming in, and we don't deal with the applications. They will proceed through a third body and will ultimately proceed anyways. I think it's important that if we are considering growth revenue from development charges as legislated by the province, and that was years ago, so that there is some pressure taken off, that we are able to identify facilities or measures that we need to mitigate that pressure. And so I think our Joint Operations Center is an exact example of that. Obviously, our libraries and other recreational facilities are very important. So by doing that, then you can be more efficient, long-term, save on energy use. And so being able to put yourself in a position to negotiate with the developer is very key for your 5-year development charges. So there's more than just saying we should watch how encouraging, because I've often heard people say in town, stop the development. Well, that's oversimplistic. I don't think you really can, unless you move away or there's some catastrophe. Or so that's sort of my comment is you're in a catch-22 sort of situation.
Okay, well, this is an interesting discussion, but not really germane to the particular topic. So any more comments on Mr. Elliott's report? Councillor Maracas, I did have you on the list. I apologize. Councillor Kim.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to Mr. Elliott. I'm just curious, if we remove the hydro funds, would we be as healthy? Would we look as healthy?
Through you, Mr. Chair, our hydro funds are bolstering our total discretionary reserves. They're considered in that analysis as discretionary reserves. And so that is a significant component of what's doing it. We made a decision to sell a commercial entity and hold on to that cash, and that is bolstering our financial position. We have to be very careful then how we invest that. If we invest it into assets that will continue to cost us money, we better make sure that we have the revenue capacity to operate those assets. If we invest it or gave it away, then we no longer have the income that it's providing. And so it's a bit of a catch-22. But in the meantime, we can borrow from it, pay it back, and save ourselves some money if it makes sense. And as I showed you last week, right now, it doesn't make sense to do that.
No, definitely. Thank you. And just as a follow-up through you, Mr. Chair, in the on page 3, when it talks about the BMA study on Aurora, and it puts us at a percentage of 145%. I guess just to go back and kind of get a follow-up on that is, if we did take it away, would we fall within that 70%, or would we be below that if we took away the hydro funds?
Through you, Mr. Chair, in that particular example, I would have to get a hold of BMA and understand exactly how they did the calculation for us, whether the hydro money was in or out, but I'm pretty sure that it would have been in. So it would drop us down the list, for sure.
Okay. Thank you.
Councillor Kim.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I know in the past, here in council as well as in the public sphere, there's been comments about the sources of debt and the benefits of debt, or benefits or the negatives of debt. And so I just want to clarify my understanding of this process. It was mentioned in the report that the overbuild in the JOC, the overbuild in the Stronach to account for future development, even though that caused a greater debt load on us, that delivers more service to the community, and as such, we would be receiving a higher level of DCs, which will pay off that debt. Overall, it seems to me a good deal to me, and I just want to verify that that is the case, because I know that there's a lot of those in council as well as in the public that are, that get confused about that process, including myself, until the last few months, just kind of asking around and verifying. So could Mr. CAO or Mr. Elliott just confirm that?
Mr. Elliott?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I just want to separate two things in that the overbuild was financed with the intention that it was overbuilt to service a future community, as it were. So we only needed 3/4 of a gym, we built a whole gym, so that for the next 5 or 8 years, the growth that was coming in would have a gym to go to, and it wouldn't overload that gym, as it were. So the portion of the overbuild was financed and then intended to be paid by the collection of development charges from that growth that was going to be coming in. And that remains a wise decision at this point, because not just the principal is fundable by DCs, but also the interest is, and it builds into the calculation of the DC charge. The other element of that is that now that we have an overbuild, our service level has increased, and when we update the DC bylaw, that increases the recoverable DC for recreation services. And so it's sort of a two-edged sword, but they're both on the right side, if I can say that. We benefit two ways from the DC legislation at that stage.
Councillor? Any other comments or questions? Councillor Abel?
Mr. Mayor, while we're on the DC, and we're looking for clarity on this, by doing funding for these overbuilds, we are eliminating the property tax payers, or the residents are property taxpayers. So by doing DCs, we're not burdening in any way the property taxpayer. And there's two different ways of looking at it. We're all taxpayers, but a property taxpayer. Mr. Mayor, I'm just wondering if I could get a comment from Mr. Elliott on that.
Mr. Elliott?
Through you, Mr. Chair, absolutely. When it comes to the capital investment of building the facility, there is no transfer for the overbuild onto the existing taxpayer in the financing mechanisms that we're using. The challenge comes in the operating costs of that facility. Obviously, we still need to light it and heat it, and it's a bigger gym, it's more of a gym, but we have to absorb those operating costs and distribute those amongst the existing taxpayers across the whole town, new, existing, but we can't distribute it to the future residents yet. We haven't figured out how to do that yet. But as soon as they arrive, they're starting to pay for it. Does that help answer your question?
No, and I think it's fair, because when people think about debt, like the SARC, they're going, oh, we were paying interest for something that you invested in, but it's not coming on your property tax bill. That payment is not. That's being
correct.
Brought in from the DC development that we continually bring in, and now we're growing, we're getting a lot more. But that was definitely put in place, the interest and that capital for that facility, so it would not affect the taxpayer. But what you're saying is oh, great, once it's built, now you got to pay for the operation. Staff is included, it's a bigger facility, and as the growth happens, then it mitigates and it's spread out again.
That's correct.
Thank you.
And just one further element, we spoke earlier on the DCs that there's faults in the legislation, as it were, I call them faults, in that we can try to optimize the recovery from the growth community to pay for the cost of infrastructure, growth infrastructure, but because of the quirks in the legislation, it doesn't quite do it all the time. Just as Halton has negotiated with the developers for fronting the costs of infrastructure, we here at Aurora recently joined the group of municipalities that go over and above the development charge legislation and have negotiated with our developers to pay us a community benefit fee as they develop. And so they're paying us an additional, in the 2C area, they're paying us an additional $1,400 per unit, and that's going into our new capital reserves to assist in topping up the DC funds to pay for growth infrastructure again.
Thank you, Mr. Elliott. My last comment would be if this was a private company and I was Warren Buffett, I'd probably be making a bid on it. All in favor of receipt, please. Contrary? That's carried. Thank you. Item 2, would someone put that on the floor, please? Councillor Thompson, thank you. Councillor Perry, second. Mr. Elliott, quick overview, sir.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think my presentation covered this section quite thoroughly. Touches on the asset management plan. What is it? Again, it's the methodology that we use to manage our assets and evaluate them. And then the 10-year capital plan is the byproduct of that work. And then the funding plan comes together there. We talk about our 10-year average required investment and how that stacks up last year to this year and so on. What the 10-year capital plan shows is a full 1% increment to our 1% of tax levy increment to our cash to capital contributions every year for the next 10 years. And that was shown in that healthy ending graph. And we need to be strong in our discipline to stay the course and stick to the plan. Because every time that we step off the plan, we now have to sort of catch up on that one step and make up the originally planned step as well. So lots of small steps makes progress, and that's what we have in mind.
Thank you, Mr. Elliott. Comments or questions on Mr. Elliott's report, please, with respect to this? If there's none, then I'll just call the vote. All in favor? Contrary? That is carried.
Karen, what was the score of the game? 3-1 Baltimore.
Does that come under new business or general information? I'm not sure. Council, may I please have a motion to adjourn? Councillor Tom, Councillor Kim, all in favor? Contrary, that is carried. Thank you very much. Thank you, staff. We appreciate your time tonight. And don't